I'm no good at taking good advice, and I'm self-careless, so don't tell me twice that lately I've been so stuck in my head that I forget just about everything my therapist said. Maybe I'm self-helpless.
Hey everyone, welcome to Self-Helpless. I'm Delaney Fisher, and today I'm chatting with Kelly Chase, who is the co-host of the Cosmosis podcast, formerly the UFO Rabbit Hole podcast, and she's also the writer and executive producer of Cosmosis, UFOs and a New Reality, which is available on Amazon Prime and Apple TV. And we are talking about UAP, Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon, strange experiences, and the limitations of human perception today. And this topic was voted on by our patrons over at patreon.com/selfhelpless. So if you'd like to submit and vote on topics covered on future episodes, feel free to check it out. So first of all, I am so glad you guys are just as weird as me and are excited to dive into this topic. We are about to nerd out on some very interesting stuff. And second, I am so glad to feature Kelly on this episode because in this space, it was pretty wild, the kinds of information people are putting out there. And obviously, I wanted to find someone reputable to have this discussion with. And Kelly does such an incredible job on her platform, basing what she shares in research, and she interviews a variety of people on her podcast. I mean, government and military officials, scientists, historians, and researchers. And they share about the intersection of history, science, spirituality, psychology. And I just really appreciate the grounded, neutral, and as unbiased as possible approach in a very strange, intense space. So I put a lot of thought into who I wanted to invite to speak on this topic for you today. We get into everything from what's the deal with UFOs and UAP? Is it real? Is it not? What does real even mean anyway? Quantum mechanics and physics. We touch on government cover ups and how trustworthy is anything they say about this stuff. Stories from people who say they've seen a craft in the sky, abduction stories, patterns with those stories, the role that trauma and mental health may play in personal experiences, and also how UAP relate to history, art, the impact of perception, and other phenomena as well, like premonition dreams, synchronicities, intuition, ghosts, and even how it relates to lore like leprechauns, the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, mermaids. It was tons of fun talking about it. And what was also cool was to hear some of the leading theories about what might be going on here. I also shared with Kelly the weirdest dream I've ever had because I was curious if anyone in this space in particular has had something similar. And I was shocked to learn that my dream is actually a very common experience. So that was really freaking weird. So whether you like to believe aliens are the answer, or this is a scientific discovery that has yet to be made, or a bunch of fake narratives from the government, something spiritual, mental health related, a social phenomena, or anything else, it's definitely interesting to explore. And of course, everything we discussed today leaves more questions than answers about, this tiny little concept called the nature of reality and stuff. So enjoy, and here is my chat with Kelly Chase. Your podcast is so fascinating and you do such an amazing job grounding this really intense topic. And I just love the deep dives and the research that you do. I have a lot of questions about your process. We'll get into it. But I've just learned a lot about history and religion and things that I didn't expect to learn. So thank you for just being a really thorough researcher and grounding something like this for people like me who don't know anything about it.
Oh my gosh, well, thank you so much. It's so fun, and I think what's so cool about, like, the UFO topic is that it really does touch kind of every part of
Yeah.
human life and experience. That's why I called it the UFO rabbit holes, because once you get down there, you're just like, "Oh my gosh, this is actually not just about UFOs, it's about everything," and that's really fun.
So interesting. So my first question is, how do you approach sifting through information to share? I assume not all information or data is created equal and that it requires a certain level of discernment. So what does your filtering process look like? How has it changed? If it has anything that you can share.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It's a tough thing to do, and I think that I've gotten
Yeah.
better at it over time, and I think I'm always kind of learning. Something that's really important to me in the work that I do is always communicating to people that like this is my whatever I'm presenting is my best thought with the information that I have at the time, but that is always subject to change with new evidence. And
Yeah.
so I'm really just kind of like laying out the path, but I'm always encouraging people to come up with their own ideas and their own opinions on things and that they should be checking things. As I go through, I've definitely found people who I really appreciate many of the academics who have stepped into the space. There's people
Mm.
like Diana Walsh-Basulka or Dr. Jeffrey Kripal who have done some really extensive writing in this area, but they're also, they're PhDs and they have like that academic rigor and discipline. The things that they
Mm.
publish often have to be peer reviewed or usually have to be peer reviewed. And so they are very careful about how far they go with something without being able to support it, that sort of thing. And so I think I've learned a lot from them. And I tend to like start in those places from more of a conceptual framework and then branching out from there and trying to understand like, how can this be supported? How does this stack up against other like the experiencer literature, people who are actually encountering these things versus
Right.
what was going on historically at the time and how does this relate to things like philosophy and just the basic ways that we make meaning in the world and that we decide what's true or not true. I joke that the UFO rabbit hole is a UFO podcast where I don't talk about UFOs that much because the
Yes.
question of UFOs takes you so much deeper into so many other things. And so I just try to be as logical about it as I can. I try to employ frameworks as much as I can that have been developed by people who are a lot smarter than me. And yeah, and I just try to be open about the fact that like this is my best effort, but it's in no way kind of like my final thought or should be anyone's final thought.
I love that you do that, and I'm so appreciative because I think we live in this weird age of like the expert and the authority, and I think when people get so stuck in their beliefs or opinions, it takes out critical thinking and receiving new information and reinterpreting and that kind of growth mindset. So I just appreciate you saying that, and I think that gives other people permission to change their mind if needed, as new info comes in. So I got sucked into all of this through one of the congressional hearings about UFOs, UAPs. I'm sure a lot of new people flooded to the space after that. And it really seemed to have shifted the conversation from are people seeing things to what are they seeing? And I know this is an impossible question, but are there any theories currently about what the heck might be happening that really resonates with you most so far with the information that you have at this time?
Yeah, it like you said, it changes all the time.
Yeah.
But the deeper I get, the more I think that this has something to do with the limitations of human perception. Because
Ooh.
like we think about our five senses and they get us through the world, right? Like you can drive a car and not hit things, like you can walk around, you can there's all sorts of things that we can do and
Right.
our senses help us do those things. And so we have this idea that our senses are an objective window into the world, that like exactly what you see when you look into a room is exactly what's in that room. But it turns out that there's been a lot of people, cognitive scientists in particular, who have been doing work over the last couple of decades. One of them in particular is Donald Hoffman. He has a book called The Case Against Reality, where he really shows that our senses were evolved to help us survive, not to give us access to all the information of what's around us. And
Mm.
so a lot of our brains are like kind of simulating and creating the world around us. And it's not that it doesn't exist, it's just that it's not all that's there in the same way that we only see like one small percentage of the light spectrum or something like that. Or you can only hear certain things, but your dog can hear things that you can't hear, right? And that
Right.
there might be things that exist around us all the time that just interface with reality differently than we do. We weren't evolved to deal with them because it like didn't really serve us to evolve that sense of them, but that they
Right.
are there. We just can't always know that with our senses.
Yes, totally makes sense. I mean, why do you think this area of exploration is important in the first place? I think a lot of people would be like, well, what's the point in doing any of this research if it doesn't impact my day to day, going to work, coming home, going on vacation, whatever? Why should we be kind of looking into this in the first place?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And I think that there's a few reasons. One is that I think that where we're at right now as a species is we have a lot of confidence about the extent to which we understand our reality. And we have
Yeah.
good reason for that. Like we can do incredible things with medicine and we can go to the moon and we can do all of these things. And so, but I think that in terms of all that there is to know, that we have a long way to go. I mean, we've known for about 100 years now that quantum mechanics is a thing and that it
Mhm.
in no way comports with traditional classical physics. And so we basically have even physics, the thing that we use to describe reality and how it works is broken. Like we can use it to do certain things, but these two different models don't even go together. Like they don't fit together. So we know that like we're missing a big piece of the puzzle. We
Right.
also, for all of our knowledge, have not at all even started to grapple with consciousness. We don't know what that is. Like everything that you know and you think and you experience and you observe in your life is happening because you are a conscious being. But it's one of the hardest unsolved problems in science is that like we don't understand what consciousness is, where it comes from, how it works, where it evolved. We don't know that. And so I think that there are several places in our kind of basic frameworks of reality where we have these gaping holes, and that we're starting to get to a place where we're seeing that, and we're also getting to the point where we're advanced enough that we're beginning to be able to get beyond it. And so we
Mm.
have things right now like quantum computers are solving these like crazy problems, and we don't really know how that works, but we're pretty sure it's because they're working with all the other computers that are exactly like it that are in other dimensions, and then they like solve the problem together. Like these are the
God,
things that
that's
are
so
happening
weird.
right now. And so that
Yeah.
would suggest that other dimensions exist. We're at a place where we're realizing that reality is a lot more complex than we thought. And, you know, for a lot of people, if it doesn't affect their day to day life, I can see why still they're like, you know what? Once you guys have figured it out, let us know.
Right,
But
right.
but I think that in terms of what it means to be a human and why we're all here, these are big questions, and that for many people, myself included, like this is really exciting stuff, and
Yeah.
it matters. But you know, I understand that for a lot of people, it's not. It just doesn't strike them quite the same way, and that's fine.
So interesting. Well, when I'm thinking about all the different theories that are out there, whether it's aliens or it's something that we haven't discovered yet that lives in the ocean, or a mass hallucination, foreign tech, or our own secret tech, whatever the theories are, it seems worth exploring. So I think no matter what it is, really would be interesting to figure out what the hell is exactly going on here. And you brought up an interesting point about dimensions. Couldn't we also think of dimensions as different layers of the planet in a way, like the deep ends of the ocean to the upper ocean to the land to the sky to above that? Isn't that technically could be considered a type of dimension where there's animals at the end of the ocean that we haven't discovered yet and they're not in our awareness yet? Or is it this quantum physics type of thing that is the
Yeah,
dimension?
I mean, I think it can be a lot of things. I think that that's a great point. Like things that are living, you know, at the bottom of the ocean are experiencing a very different version of this planet than we are. And you could actually argue, I mean, and really make the point that this is a water world. 70% of the surface of the planet is water. And
Yeah.
so, you know, we're more a water world than we are anything else. And we know almost nothing about what's at the bottom of the ocean. We know more about the surface of Mars and the surface of the moon than we know about what's at the bottom of our own oceans. So like there could be stuff down there that we have absolutely no idea about. In fact, there's almost certainly stuff down there that we have no idea about. And so like that's one way to think about it is that we live in this world and we think it's the whole thing, but that humans are really kind of just in this very specific part of the earth.
Yeah.
I think that there's also, you know, what you're talking about like with perception. I think that there's different kinds of perception, and that some things like if you go out into your yard and you walk up to an ant, like does the ant even know you're there? Like do they even,
Mhm.
or are you both operating on such like different scales and it's not set up to like observe you? Like did they even really know that you're a living thing that's there? I'm not convinced that they do.
Right.
And then there's the idea of just like actual other dimensions, which play a really big part in things like string theory and you know, some kinds of quantum mechanics and quantum computing and all of these things. But the thing is, we don't have any shred of proof that these other dimensions actually exist. Quantum computers is probably the closest that we have. because they work, and we're not totally sure how that's possible unless there are other dimensions. And so, but we don't have access to that. So the thing is about people talking about the interdimensional thing is that there's so much to it. And in some ways, like it's too broad of a word, but we just don't have better words to apply to it because it can mean so many different things to different people.
Another thing is I always assumed that media about UFOs, UAP, the things that we see in TV, movies, all that kind of came first before people started claiming to have seen UFOs or had experiences about abduction or otherwise. Basically, that the media has been influencing people's perception. But I'm curious to know if there's any history that you can share with us that maybe predates this thought, because I think a lot of people just kind of assume that.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the most fascinating questions, right? Is that we have this conception of UFOs and that what that phenomenon looks like that only really goes back to about 1947. And even then, kind of this idea of like what we would call like a gray alien, like the big eyes and the all of that,
Yes.
like in abductions, that's something that didn't really pop up until like the 70s.
Okay.
And so it may be a little before that, but mostly in the 70s, and then kind of like took root after that. So I mean, there's a lot of time between 1947 and the 1970s where that's not what people were seeing. People were seeing for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part, beings that actually looked very human. They would often say they were coming from Venus or someplace where like we hadn't seen the surface of Venus yet. And they looked very human. But if you go back even further, like there was one of the things that I find most interesting is that there was this um, airship flap in the 1890s. So out like especially kind of in like the western part of the US, there were all of these like little pioneer towns out there that had these reports of these zany looking ships that kind of looked like blimps or dirigibles kind of before that, but they had all the kinds of like weird propellers and baskets and sails and just like they were absurd looking, completely absurd looking, that looked like kind of theoretical tech that it was being thought about at the time, but was not that. And these things would come and people, humans would get out of these things and come down and talk to the people. And these would be like very mundane conversations. Like there's one of my favorite stories where like this guy comes down and he's just like, we need some egg salad sandwiches. And so they like made him a bunch of egg salad sandwiches and they were like, bye. And like, what was that? We've had stories for a really long time, for thousands of years, about beings, some of which look very human, some of which look very not human, that were flying around in some kind of ship in the sky and that were coming down and interacting with people. And we see this through, not through our mythology, folklore, and religions and all of that going back for millennia. And a lot of times we've just written these off. But there's a lot of consistency when you really get to like the source material between like how these things look. And what's crazy is that they always seem to appear to us in a way that's kind of what our perception is of something that would be more advanced than us. And
Mm.
so, like, once we became a technological spacefaring species, we started encountering these things that were like technological and spacefaring. And so, I think for a lot of people, that's enough to kind of, brush it off and say, this is just stories or fantasy or crazy people or something like that. But I think for a lot of people who've seen these things, you need a bit better explanation. And so really what it leads us to is this question of why is it that it changes over time? Like why is it that it fits our expectations of it? Like what is going on that
Mm.
in what way is it controlling our and influencing our perception of them? And there's a lot of people like Jacques Vallée, who's an incredible ufologist, who've written really in depth about that idea and what it could mean. But it's fascinating. There's so much history there.
Yeah, it's like, is it influencing how we're perceiving it, or are we projecting our own thoughts onto what it is based on whatever our level of awareness or consciousness or tech is at that time? When it comes to, if you look back at different art pieces and you can see little, UFOs in the background and stuff like that, is there a way that people have deciphered, okay, were they painting what they knew or were they painting something kind of fantastical, right? Like we have a variety of art today where we're painting things that we see and we're painting things that are coming from our imagination. Like how are we determining maybe which art to take in the more, I guess, more realism space versus fantasy?
Yeah, I mean the truth is we don't have a We don't have great answers for that, especially
Okay.
the further you go back in time and kind of the less access we have to understanding what the artist was thinking or how they were presenting it, or, you know, because
Right.
there's stuff we can go all the way back to literally some of the earliest cave paintings and see some beings that people are very quick to say, like, oh, look, they were interacting with aliens or whatever you want to call them back then, because like here they are on this cave painting, but like maybe they were just doodling. Like
Right.
we,
Right.
we really don't
Right.
we really don't know. There are a few exceptions. Like there's a case, I forget the name of the town. I'm sorry about that, but there was a town
No
in like
worries.
the 1500s that had this report, and it was something that was like reported, and we have like records of it from various sources, that like one day in the middle of the afternoon there was what appeared to be some kind of like an airship battle over this town, where all these
Wild.
different things were flying around and seemed to be like fighting each other, like the way we would think of almost like a fighter pilot fight kind of situation.
Weird.
But they were very strange craft that were like, some were like long and cylindrical and some were round and they were like weird geometric shapes. And there's actually like a wood carving of it, a very famous one that still exists. And so, you know, it's hard to say exactly
Mm.
what happened that day, but in that case, we have this like kind of fantastical image of all these crazy ships in the sky, and that look very different than what you would think. Like I'm saying ships because that's like an easier word to access, but it doesn't really look like that if you look it up.
Yeah.
But there's something crazy going on in the sky, and we have records of that, and then we have the art. And so in that case, we still
Hmm.
can't draw any hard conclusions, but we can at least, there's like a little more to hold on to there. But otherwise, you know, we have to, if we're going to be objective, we have to admit that like we don't really know if those were UFOs that people were drawing or not.
Absolutely. You know, especially with the people that you've interviewed on your podcast, different government officials, researchers, academics, when UAP conversation entered more of the mainstream, there's so much distrust for the government, right? There's a lot of corruption. So it seems like if they're sharing something, there's an ulterior motive of why they're sharing it with us. But if they're not sharing it, we think they're lying to us. It kind of seems like a lose lose no matter what they do, because collectively there's a lot of distrust. What is the conversation with the people really in this space, and how are they deciphering information based on that?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's really tough because what we do know, a lot of the kind of honestly, the best evidence we have for the reality of the UFO phenomenon is the evidence that we have of the cover up. Like we have
Mm.
declassified documents and just things that have gotten out over the years for the last like 80 years of evidence that they've been desperately trying to cover this up, that they have been, you know, going back to the idea about the media that, you know, um, in the kind of like the 70s, 80s, and 90s in particular, that the CIA was actually working with the media to put some of this stuff out there. Because, like, if they put it out in a movie, then people are like, oh, that's just a fantasy. But a lot of it's actually pretty legit. Like, if you
Mm.
watch Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Jacques Vallée worked on that film behind the scenes.
Wow.
And there's a lot in there that wasn't really in the public consciousness before then about how this phenomenon actually works. So they've been lying to us for like 80 years.
Yeah.
And so then when they come to say that like, oh, we're going to tell you the truth, it's kind of hard to like believe them.
Right.
And the truth is, like, it's really complicated because what's going on right now isn't just about this fight about, you know, some people think they should tell us and other people think they shouldn't. It goes much deeper than that because there's a lot of evidence that there has been attempts to reverse engineer technology based on technology that we've recovered from crash sites and that sort of thing, and that has given certain advantages to certain companies over other companies. So there's kind of like there's kind of these giant lawsuits that could emerge if it turns out that like certain companies were given this insane advantage over their
Ah.
competitors. There's also the issue that to hide this stuff, that a lot of it isn't actually in the possession of the government. It's in the possession of defense contractors like Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman. I'm not saying they have it. I'm saying people like them, just
Mm.
before I get a letter from someone. But you know, people like that they're the ones who actually have this tech. And so there's like a lot that needs to be done because like Congress hasn't been given oversight over this. Taxpayer money to the tune of trillions of dollars has likely been spent on this without our knowledge. We then actually don't even have possession over the technology. And so there needs to be mechanisms for us to like regain that technology and to bring it under actual congressional oversight. So a lot of like what's going on with disclosure is kind of this more like boring, like legislative, policy stuff about them fighting over who's going to get to own what and who's going to be held responsible for what, like who's going to be in trouble and does everybody who was involved in this cover up, are they now criminally liable? It's those sorts of issues. And so that just like complicates, it makes the whole thing like massively more complicated.
And that's why when you even hearing that, you can't help but wonder, okay, I'd rather like the public think it's aliens are the thing when it's actually maybe our craft or a different country's craft that, we're going to be using for something kind of terrible. It adds to this kind of spiral of what is actually going on. And that's just got to be really hard to be in your position trying to sift through this information. And in your experience so far, interviewing people or I'm sure people write in with their stories and things like that. What is the line between maybe you feel like somebody experiencing some kind of phenomena versus maybe somebody's not doing so well mentally and maybe something else is going on? Are there connections? Does it feel very separate for you? That's got to be an especially challenging situation to manage.
It really is. And I've actually been doing a lot of work on this recently because it's a really messy conversation for a
Yeah,
few reasons. One is that, all of our kind of mental health models are based on this idea that, mental health is really measured by the extent to which your thoughts and your behavior um, comport with like consensus reality.
right.
And so when somebody sees something that sounds crazy or that other people aren't seeing, or they have an experience that most people would agree would be impossible,
Mm,
then they're automatically thought to be potentially crazy. The problem is, is that mental health issues do exist. Things like, schizophrenia and delusional disorders and those sorts of things are very real, and a lot of them have organic causes that we can pinpoint and that get better with medicine. And so we have,
mm,
this kind of indication that like it's not what we're, I would never suggest that those kinds of mental health issues don't exist. Where it gets even more complicated is that having an encounter with something that you really don't understand and the
yeah,
trauma of that, what it does to a person in their life, and then especially when it changes everything about you and how you see the world, and you're dealing with all the like processes of like trauma that come after that, but you also can't talk to anybody about it because people will
right,
think you're crazy if you do. When you go through something like traumatic like that, it does impact your mental health, right? Like
right.
it can cause you, having that kind of trauma can cause you to have mental health issues. Because like a question we have to ask ourselves is, why do certain people have these experiences and other people don't? Like we have to be able
Right.
to answer that question. And one of the answers could be, and I happen to think that this is a really good answer, is that there's something called the filter thesis, which is basically that the idea that our brains, like we were talking about earlier, filter out most of what's around us and kind of like narrows it down so that we're having kind of an experience that we can handle and that's useful to us, but that
Right.
there's more out there. But if you experience some kind of emotional trauma or even like some physical trauma, like brain trauma, something like that, that it can cause your filters to not work the way that they are set up to. So things come in that you wouldn't normally be aware of. And we see that like a lot of people who are lifelong experiencers have experienced like significant childhood trauma. People who experience trauma like a car accident or something like that, where they like, or like a near death experience, that often that can open people up to then having more kind of anomalous experiences after that. It's this giant ball of yarn, and it's so hard to untangle because like it's not as easy as saying like some people are crazy and some people are having real experiences, because like trauma and mental health and stigma and all of that are all wrapped up in this thing. If you pull one thread, it's just it all comes apart. And so I think that that's a place where I'm really focusing my work right now, because I think we don't have any good answers, but I think that that's a place where we need to start finding some better answers.
Those are all such great points. And look, I'm very open minded that anything could be happening. Curious to know. I mean, I think this happens in every space. Some people have good intentions, some people maybe not so good intentions. Some people might not even be aware of their intentions, but seems like maybe there's some culty things going on where people are like, this is the truth and you kind of have to follow me. And I'm curious to know how you feel about maybe some of those things. Do you think some people are kind of taking advantage in this space?
It's a very fair question. I mean, like you said, I think that some people are aware that they're doing it, and I think that there's other people who just kind of drink their own Kool-Aid.
Okay.
And something that I'm really passionate about in my work is that trying to help equip people to deal with that aspect of things, because what happens is what happened to me, right? So I've only been doing this for about 3.5 years. Before that, I had no interest in any of this. I didn't believe any of it was real. And because I've been going through it, I think I'm still going through it. This kind of like dismantling of what I thought the world was, the things that I thought were true. And when you're going through that dismantling period and you're realizing that there was a lot of stuff that you believed without really looking into it, or that you
Right.
were really like wrong about certain things, it can be really destabilizing. And we as humans, like, we want to have the answer. We want to know what's going on, and we want to be able to trust ourselves. And when you realize that you've had a lot of thoughts that weren't correct, it can really mess you up in a lot of ways. Like, it can be a lot of fun going through this process, but it
Yeah.
can also be really destabilizing. People can have a lot of anxiety. There can be like depression and just like all kinds of things that happen. And so in that space where people are kind of going through that, it's really easy for somebody to step in and say like, I have the answer. And then and
Mm.
people who are desperately looking for an answer are like, well, thank God, because I lost all my answers and I need some, and this person seems to know what's going on. And so,
Right.
I talk about that a lot with various friends of mine who, we all kind of have different private communities that we talk to and that we work with built. And we actually have conversations about like how to not start a cult, because it's
Yes. Amen.
like, how do you equip people to not just not start a cult, but to help people not fall into that, to like really
Right.
like use their critical thinking, to rely on their own judgment, and to not like outsource their sense of meaning to somebody else, that like ultimately you have to know what you believe.
Amazing. And I'm so glad that somebody like you is in that space to kind of combat some of this other stuff, because you can see how dangerous it can get. I mean, I'm kind of fascinated by all the cult documentaries popping up,
Yeah.
but you can really see the dangers in, like you said, lending your own kind of meaning and critical thinking to somebody else. So you mentioned that just a few years ago you weren't really interested in this, you didn't think it was real or existed or whatever. What happened in your situation that caused that shift or curiosity?
So I had been, it was like the spring of 2021. We were just kind of coming out of like lockdown and all that craziness.
Okay.
And my family was going to go on vacation to the Outer Banks in North Carolina. And I am not good at going on vacation, and I'm a workaholic. And so like I needed something. I was like, I'm going to be at the beach all week. Like, what am I going to do? And so I remembered that I had seen something very strange in the sky there when I was a kid. When I was like 13 years old, I had been out on the porch one night looking up at the stars, and I had this very strange thought that if I looked up right that minute, like that second, that I would see a UFO, which was like a thought that I had never had before or since. And
Sure.
um, and I looked up, and there was this light in the sky that was coming across the sky, and it did like two hard right angle turns, and then just one like phew, like off across the horizon. It just like moving faster than anything I'd ever seen in my life. And by the way, I've since learned that a lot of people, that's like a common feature of UFO sightings, is that people have that thought. Like, if I look up right now, I'll see something, which is weird.
Oh, wow.
And so ran inside and I told my family, and they of course like didn't believe me and laughed at me. And it wasn't that I forgot it, but I just never, I mean, what do you do with that? Like, it's so much easier to just sort of believe that like you were mistaken or you were wrong somehow, but it was just such a clear memory and it really stuck with me. And I'd started noticing in the news that there were these stories about, oh, like the Pentagon is saying that like actually there is stuff in the sky that we don't know what it is and we don't think it's human. And so like, what the heck does that mean?
Right.
And so I started looking into it, and I was like, I'm going to figure it out. I was like at the beach. I'm like, I'm going to have a whole week and I'm going to get to the bottom of this. I'm going to figure the whole thing out. And
Yeah.
obviously I didn't, but I did get to a point where I realized like, wow, there is really something here. Like, undeniably, there is something going on. And I didn't know what it was. I didn't know, I still haven't come to any conclusions about what I think it is. But there's something very real and very strange going on, and the government has gone to great lengths to not just cover it up, but to shape our perceptions of it and to make us think about it in certain ways and not think about it in other ways. I actually tend to think it's
Wow.
probably not aliens. I haven't ruled it out because I can't, but the fact that that's the only way that the government or the media ever portrays it is as something coming from
Oh,
another planet makes me kind of suspicious because they've invested so much in making us think various like those that making us think that it's that in particular, that
yeah.
most people, it doesn't even occur to them that it could be something besides aliens coming from another planet. And so, yeah, so that's how I got into it. And then I was just obsessed. Like I couldn't, and I'm still obsessed and I can't stop. So
My gosh, it's so interesting. And that you mentioned that you discovered that that's kind of a pattern with people who have this kind of experience, a thought. They have this thought to look up and see something. What other patterns or themes have you noticed in people who have these types of experiences?
oh, that's such a great question. So something that is really common that they don't talk about a lot because it makes you sound insane is that I didn't really identify and I still don't really what happened to me is like a telepathic communication like when I thought like if I just look up it just felt more like an impulse or an instinct or something.
Right.
But a lot of people who encounter UFOs or beings, non-human beings report getting some sort of telepathic communication and being told something with a voice that they can hear very clearly in their mind. There's also people often report lost time, just are looking at something in the sky and then all of a sudden it's 45 minutes later and they
Mm,
don't realize how that happened. So there's weird like slips of time that happen. And one of the craziest things that actually you see in a lot of these cases is that it it changes people's personality. Like it changes who they are afterwards,
wow.
where suddenly they have this new awareness of, people who were atheists might start believing in God. People suddenly have a lot more concern about things like the health of the planet and like about, spirituality and those sorts of concerns. And it's really interesting to me. That's one of the most interesting parts of it is that it seems to influence how we think about the world and the kinds of thoughts that we have, which I think is really, really fascinating.
You hit on another question I had for you is how is this impacting people's beliefs? You mentioned, okay, somebody might be atheist and start to believe in God. What about somebody who's religious in a specific set of beliefs? Is that I wonder if that makes them kind of double down on that, or does it maybe shift how they view their religion or religion in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for a lot of people who are religious, it kind of depends on their like orientation to their religion. Because some
Okay.
people are like their religion they're whatever religion they are because that's how they were raised and they went to church, but it's not something that they're like really invested in, right? And
Mm,
so I think you can go in a lot of different directions with those types of people. For people who are more kind of invested in their faith and have kind of like more of a connection to a certain doctrine, a lot of times they will interpret their whatever their experience was kind of through that lens. It doesn't sometimes it'll cause people to like question their religion, but a lot of times people find it to be more like confirmatory of their religion. And you'll see a lot of
interesting.
the discussion that goes on is about like especially currently and not just by like people on the internet, but like um I happen to know that there's like there are whole factions within the intelligence community who very much believe that what we're actually talking about here is angels and demons, and
Wow.
that like that's what that's what UFOs are.
Yeah.
And I'm somebody who just sort of like stays agnostic on that. Like I'm interested in all of the different theories, and I don't really commit myself to one or the other. But it is really interesting because I think that there's this idea that like if people found out that these things are real, that it would cause like this crisis of faith or that people would lose their religion. And I don't actually, from what I've seen, that's not the case at all. I think that people kind of adapt what they already believe to encompass this kind of new reality.
Right. You can project whatever belief you want onto that because we don't know what the hell is going on.
Right.
So that makes a lot of sense. And there's so much phenomena out there, right? Like premonition dreams and synchronicities and weird feelings that you get or, intuition. Do you think all of that is connected? Do you think they're kind of separate experiences?
Yeah, actually. So we just my creative partner Jay Christopher King and I, we just got done. We released a docu-series called Cosmosis: UFOs in a New Reality that came out just a couple of months ago, and you can get it on Amazon Prime or Apple TV or a whole bunch of other places. And we really explored that question there,
Mm,
especially in episode 3, but kind of throughout the whole series. We really wanted to present something that's not just like we get this very particular view of the phenomenon through the government and through disclosure. And it's this very sort of, it's all about the crafts, it's all about the bodies, and it's all kind of this assumption that this is like something that's coming here for reasons that are like our own, like it's some sort of a military threat or something like that.
right.
But there's so much more involved in it. And the more you really research it, you recognize that like all of these things are interrelated. So people who, like for instance, are abductees are also way more likely to have experienced things like, seeing things like orbs, poltergeist stuff, like hauntings. If you want to call it that, all of these words are very loaded. Precognitive dreams, profound synchronicities, that sort of thing, and all of these things are tied up in each other. Like if you have a UFO sighting, even a kind of mundane one, it doesn't always happen. But for a lot of people in the wake of that, they end up suddenly they're having precognitive dreams. Suddenly they're having these like crazy synchronicities that are like upending their life, or they're experiencing some sort of like poltergeist phenomena in their home. And like that sounds crazy, and it makes it even
Mm,
harder to have these conversations because people are like, what are the chances? Right. But if we
yeah.
go back to like the filter thesis model of things, if something happened to you that kind of changed the way that your brain or your consciousness kind of interfaces with reality, and you're suddenly accessing things that you weren't before, then it would make sense that like all of these things would be happening. So I think these things are actually deeply related. I don't even think it's that they're related. I think that in some ways they're like aspects of the same thing. We just don't know what that is.
You mentioned abductee. What does that exactly mean if we don't really know what's going on?
So, once again, with all of this stuff, it's super complicated. So there
Right.
are people who who have very specific memories, who remember, usually starting at a pretty young age and going kind of throughout their life, but it seems to like most of the activity happens kind of when they're younger, and then
Mm,
when they're sort of like in late adolescence into early adulthood. And and then like it continues throughout life, but usually there's bigger breaks in between. And so those people, some of them will like have really distinct memories of things like being floated out a window of their house, or waking up to beings standing over their bed who take them somewhere.
mm,
Some of them have memories of being somewhere else, of being, a lot of times people identify it as being on a craft. Some people really have memories where they're like looking out windows and like seeing the earth below, that sort of thing. Other people are just in sort of some sort of a like very sterilized, like white environment that's almost like a medical environment. And people who recall what happens kind of after they're abducted, it follows like very predictable patterns of them basically being like experimented on different ways, like various like samples being taken from them, like often like reproductive material, which makes this even harder to talk about. There's so much stigma around that. I guest host monthly on Whitley Strieber's podcast, who wrote the book Communion, and was one of the first like really public experiencers. And the whole like joke about like anal probes or whatever, like that comes from him. When you think about the horror of something like that happening to you, and then people like making a joke out of horrible trauma, like, so it's really complicated. So some people have memories like that, but there are also some people who it's more fragmentary,
mm,
where they remember kind of like looking out the window and seeing beings, and then like everything goes black, or they wake up and there's something over their bed, but they don't remember what happens after that. But unlike a lot of this other stuff, it often leaves physical traces behind. People have very distinctive marks on their body, like scars. They're these kind of, often it's like a kind of almost like a little scoop that's almost like taken out of their skin. Sometimes they'll have signs of having struggled or having been restrained, or they'll just wake up and like their clothes are on inside out, and they know they weren't when they went to bed, like that sort of thing. And so they live with a lifelong trauma. They don't like, a lot of them don't sleep. Like
mm.
it's really hard for them to sleep, especially at night. They have a lot of anxiety. They have like all the characteristics of PTSD and all of these other things that they have to live with. When you dig into it and realize how many similarities there are between people who've never met, people who aren't looking for any kind of attention, people who have never told a soul, it's really compelling once you start looking into it.
I'm sure a lot of people could also hear that and say, well, what if it was a different type of traumatic experience that they're envisioning as this other situation of being abducted? What kind of responses would you have to that?
I mean, I think that such a thing is certainly possible, right? Trauma can do really messed up things to the brain. Another complicating factor, because of course there has to be more complications with all of this, is that there's really good reason to believe that the government has been tracking abductees, that they're interested in abductees, and that the government has actually abducted people who were abductees and tried to make it look like an abduction. So I know that sounds insane, but if just first, you don't have to believe it, but for anyone
Right.
listening, like if you take the as a thought experiment, if there are people being abducted by non-humans, the government's probably very interested in that. So I mean, do I think it could be happening? Yes. The thing that makes me think that it's not that it's not that in most cases is just having met so many people who have gone through it and talked to so many people who are telling their story for the very first time. And there's certain stuff that I'm actually even holding back now, because there are, like I said, like there are certain things that kind of like repeat over and over again. There's
Yeah.
certain like like very specific technology, things that they wear or that they hold. There's very specific marks that are left on the body. Like there's just a lot of things that like people who had no interest or access to this stuff before, who have no real reason to lie, seem to know things that they shouldn't know, or that like there's kind of there's hallmarks of an abduction, I would say, that are very common.
Are you finding that they're coming from certain places in the world or, city versus suburb or anything like that? Are there any connections in the areas?
No, it can be really anywhere. There's this idea that like it happens more in rural places. It doesn't. Can happen in New York City. The thing that seems to be most common is is that number one is that it runs in families. Their mom or their dad was being abducted. Like it kind of runs in certain bloodlines. And what's really interesting about it is that in families where it kind of runs in a bloodline and then somebody's like, no more, like I'm not having kids, but their sister or their cousin or somebody has a kid, that then it'll like skip over to like somebody else kind of in that particular bloodline. And so it's like really difficult to know what that's all about, because I mean, it happens to people of all different backgrounds and ethnicities. So we can't say that it's like there's some particular bloodline. It's so we don't know what that's about. And there does seem to be in certain cases connection to maybe people who are involved in kind of like secret programs, especially pertaining to the early space program and the like secret programs that have grown out of that. Sometimes, children of people who are like in kind of like secret space program type stuff, that it'll happen too. But once again, that's kind of like I wouldn't say that's common enough to like draw any conclusions about it.
Okay. I've also heard that the way that our brains work, we're like kind of meaning making machines, right? Like we have to make meaning out of things. And experiencing synchronicities is just kind of a coincidence because you think of, all right, well, that was an interesting synchronicity, but think of all the millions of thoughts you had that day that weren't synchronicities. But there's just some things that are so weird that you truly can't explain. I'm wondering if I could share a personal experience with
Oh,
you
please.
because there was really one experience that I don't understand, and I'm curious to know if it's a pattern with anybody you've spoken to. But I had a dream, and it just felt like a different type of dream, a different texture, I guess, if you will, where I felt like almost like my feet lifted up while I was sleeping and I kind of shot out of my body into space. And I know this sounds so fucking weird. And all of a sudden, I'm kind of like flying back to Earth through these giant orangey orbs of light or energy. I don't know what it was. And I was going so fast back to Earth. And I had this weird awareness like, do not forget that this is happening. This is wild, almost feeling like I'm on a roller coaster. And then I woke up thinking, what the hell was that? Did not feel like a typical dream of mine. Am I the only one? Has anybody expressed something similar like that? Because that really freaked me out.
No, you're not. You're not. And
Okay.
listening to your story, it's like check, check, check. Like in terms of just like things that are super, super common. So
Weird.
first of all, the feeling of it's so funny. You even used a word I used the other day in describing it to someone else. You said the dream felt like it had a different texture. It's just different.
So weird.
And so that's something that happens to people a lot. The feeling of like being laying down in bed and then shooting out of your body is something that a lot of people will call it like astral projection. It's something that, for the record, the CIA invested a lot of time and energy in researching, and that is, it sounds crazy, but it's
Whoa.
absolutely real. The government knows it's real, and they use this stuff in intelligence gathering efforts, and they have for decades. And you can learn to do it. But yes, so the shooting out of your body and kind of traveling that would be like astral projection, orange orbs of light. If you'll actually, the cover of Cosmosis, our docuseries,
Yeah.
and our podcast, you'll see there's 3 orange orbs of light, because like the orange orbs in particular are something that is like often associated with encounters that people have, where a lot of times they have a sense that those orange orbs are conscious, that like they're aware and that they're able to communicate with them. They often have the feeling that this is some kind of a being that they've known for a long time, like outside of this life, and that like
Weird.
that we're connected to them in some ways. And then just like the whole thing, this idea of like, I can't forget this people have these experiences. I've had experiences like that, where you get kind of a glimpse outside of just sort of the everydayness of our day-to-day lives, and then you kind of come back into your body, and you're like, did that even happen? Like,
Oh my gosh. It's so vivid. It's like, I guess, a lucid dream where it shook me. And I have to say, I was not researching anything about this space. Because I know sometimes maybe if you're feeding your brain a lot of information, that might impact your dreams or what. This was not on my radar. Now that I've had that experience and I'm chatting with you, is
mhm.
there a theory that what people are seeing are other people floating around outside their bodies?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of conversation around. My friend Joshua Cutchin wrote a book called Ecology of Souls. Another mentor of mine, Jeffrey Kripal, he was a consulting producer on our docuseries, and he's a professor of religion at Rice University.
Mm,
There are a lot of people who've written really eloquently about the connection between these experiences and the dead. And, like Jeff Kripal very famously said, like, has and continues to say that like he thinks that it's funny what the government is doing, talking about these craft, and like he's like, well, you're gonna shoot down souls, because that's what he considers them in many ways. Like he thinks it's more likely that a lot of these things are souls. Going
interesting.
deeper, there's something called the Free study, that was the largest study that had been done to date on experiencers, like people just reporting what had actually happened to them. And something that came out of that is that like we think about UFOs as being physical craft, and in some cases they certainly are, but that's not the majority of experiences that most people have.
Mm.
Most people, even people who encounter beings and that sort of thing, aren't encountering a physical craft as you would think about it. They're encountering these like orbs of light. And so like there's a
Wow.
lot of thought that they could be conscious beings, in and of themselves, or, something along those lines, that it could literally be a soul of some kind. And there's actually, it's so cutting edge that it's like a little, it's hard to tell what's going to shake out of this at
Yeah.
this point. But there is a lot of there is a lot of really interesting science going on with plasma right now, which is like the fourth state of matter. And if
Oh.
you it's basically like electromagnetically charged ions and particles, that can behave like kind of this, like a coherent being, sort of like that it can move all together. And apparently, like if it gets complex enough in the way that electromagnetism, like the patterns in which it moves through the plasma, that like there's thoughts that maybe that they could be conscious, like that they could be intelligent beings. And if plasma can be intelligent, then like is the sun intelligent? Like,
Right.
because that's made out of plasma. So there,
Whoa.
right? So there's all of that's like highly speculative. I'm not saying for sure any of that's true, but I mean, these are the ways that people are thinking through those things. And the orb phenomena is a huge part of this. In fact, occurs way more often than like someone seeing a flying saucer.
This is really fascinating that my experience is more common than I realized. So were you a big seeker as a kid? Did you find yourself having a lot of questions, or is this something that's kind of new in adulthood?
Yeah, I feel like at this point I'm in some ways getting back to the person I was when I was a kid, which is really
Okay.
cool. Because when I was a kid, I was really into this stuff. Like, I was not UFOs actually, but I was really into like, I read a lot of like Stephen King novels, and then I got like really into kind of like hauntings. I remember I was like obsessed with like the Amityville horror stuff and getting into all of that. And I had wanted when I was a kid, I found at my mom's house, she found this like old newsletter from this music school that I was in. And I was like the student of the month or whatever. And they asked me what I wanted to be. And I said a parapsychologist, which like I don't even remember that. That's so
Incredible.
funny. So I feel like when I was a kid, I was like really into this stuff and had all kinds of questions and was very exploratory. And then, you kind of get to be a teenager and, you start worrying about other stuff and you don't want to be the weird kid in class talking about the weird stuff. And I think that then I kind of, as I got older, I wasn't really as interested in all of this stuff. And I kind of walked away from it for a very long time. And it wasn't until like my late 30s when, I got back into this UFO stuff and it kind of reopened that for me. And it's been cool though, because I feel like I'm getting back to kind of like a child. For me, it's a very childlike kind of wonder and interest.
Yeah, it makes me think, does everybody kind of start off that way and then society really just like tramples that out of them? Or are some people just naturally asking more questions than others? It's hard to know because you kind of start looking at that maybe as an adult and we've all been through the ringer of society. But I just find myself asking so many questions and that my husband does not ask. And both things are totally fine. But it makes me think, why am I always questioning, like, what the fuck is this place?
Yeah.
And maybe not everybody around me is doing that, or at least maybe as often. And I just remember being like even as a kid thinking like, why do we go to the mall to buy clothes to then go to the mall in our new clothes? Like I was
Yeah.
asking those questions like, what is the purpose of this shit? And I don't know, why are we in a car right now? Shouldn't we be kind of just living on land? I don't know. Is that natural curiosity there for everybody? And we've been told to kind of squash it in a way. How do you feel about that?
I mean, I feel like for people like us, like I think
Yeah.
it was definitely squashed in me. Like at a certain point, people are just like,
Yeah.
be serious. And I was like, fine.
Right.
And I'm glad that I'm glad that I've gotten back to it because it really does feel like more who I am authentically
Right.
to be questioning and to be doing this kind of work. But also like my husband, like he's very, very supportive of me. He like loves that I love it, and
Yeah.
he doesn't, to his credit, does not think I'm crazy. But and like is very open-minded to it, but like he does not care. Like and for a lot of people, like I know because there's so many people who get into this stuff and it hooks us. And like I walked away from my entire career and this is like
Wow.
what I do now. And I wouldn't recommend that for everyone, right? Like that's
Mm.
a commitment. And then a lot of other people are just like, cool.
Yeah.
Like let me know if they figure out anything
Right.
definitive. And
Right.
it just doesn't strike them in the same way. And I don't know why that like I do think society kind of like squeezes it out of us in a certain extent, but I think some people just aren't predisposed to care about that
Yeah.
kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And we, as humans can, use anything as escapism, right? Like, do you find that, maybe some of the people that you come across in this space are maybe really interested in this stuff and maybe ignoring or neglecting some of the things in their life, and it's kind of a form of escape in an unhealthy way?
That absolutely happens. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it can happen a lot. A lot of people got really into this like during or right after the pandemic. And so
Oh,
and I think
yeah.
I think those things are absolutely related. Like, I think
Right.
part of it was, like, people had more time on their hands and people who had kind of, like, a latent interest or proclivity for being interested in this kind of stuff found it again. And, certain people were just bored or looking for escapism. And I mean, in anything, it's so gripping and there's always another mystery and there's always another crazy story and there's always like if you really want to lose yourself in something, this is something that you can absolutely lose yourself in and you have to I'm actually really grateful for the fact that like all of my like UFO friends all live in other states. Like we go to conferences, we meet up, like when I'm working on my docuseries, we travel together and I love that. But like
Right.
I live in Ohio, in the place that I've lived my entire life and like most of my friends I've had for 20 plus years and none of them are into this stuff and like that is really good for me. Like that's a that's a really good balance.
Good balance, yes.
Yeah.
How does this impact how you view other things? Like, because once you start looking at this, maybe what things from history, maybe what people were seeing or what they thought was happening. I don't know, stories about fairies or leprechauns or the Loch Ness monster. Just like, does that come up in this space as well, as being connected?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
there's actually some really incredible scholarship that's been done around by Jacques Vallée and others around how similar fairy lore is to the UFO phenomenon and to the abduction phenomenon. Like there's a
Oh,
lot
wow.
of similarities there. And we're working on season 2 of our show right now. And actually, we're hoping for season 3 to actually go to Ireland and focus on. So,
How cool.
and also like cryptids. Like I've gotten much more interested in like the Loch Ness monster and Bigfoot and like that kind of stuff. Like it's all there's weirdly a lot of relation there also. It kind of opens up this whole crazy world of something I like about it is that it kind of makes you believe people more. You know, like when we hear something that like just doesn't make sense or we hear some crazy story from somebody and you're just like that can't be possibly true. But then
Right.
when you hear like the same story from like thousands of people and you really dive into it, you're like, "Oh, I think," and most of them feel exactly the way like you were describing feeling about that like weird dream that you had where you're just like, "Does any of this sound like?" And I'm like, "Oh no, it's not. A million people are going through this exact same thing like and have experienced something very similar." And so I think, it's hard to draw any conclusions about that. Like, do I think Bigfoot's literally walking out around in the woods? Like, I don't know. But I know that the world is such that people are seeing that happen. And so,
Yeah.
like, what is going on? And I'm very open to whatever that answer could be, but what is going on such that so many people are seeing what we would call like Bigfoot or Sasquatch out in the woods? Like, what is that? What does that mean?
Yeah. And you can even look back, people worshiping the rain. And now, present day, we understand something called precipitation and all this stuff. We have words for it, or we understand maybe the science a little bit more. And I mean, still mysterious as to why and how it developed or was created. So I think there's absolutely a place still for, modern ritual, ancient beliefs, and science. I'm not saying one thing is right over the other. And it just makes you think, what else are we going to be uncovering in the next centuries to come that we're kind of looking at it from that lens. My final question for you is, you have this incredible docu-series out. How did that come to be? Anything that you want to share about that experience?
Yeah, so this happened back in the summer of 2022. It was right before the big hearing with David Grush, the
Okay.
congressional hearing. And so this was right after the article had come out. And we knew that the congressional hearings were coming. And a friend of mine, who's now my business partner, one of them, Jordan Flowers, invited like a bunch of people who were working in the space because we were all just like, we feel like there's going to be so many more people who are going to be interested in this topic and like how do we meet the need? Because like
Ah,
so many of the ideas that people have, like we've been discussing are like not because it's all they've ever been shown in the media and that sort of thing. Like they're thinking like it's aliens from outer space, eh,
right.
and there's so much more to it than that. It's far more complicated. So we spent a weekend at his house in Connecticut just sort of like brainstorming and trying to, talking about our different projects and figuring out, if there are ways that we could work together. And Jordan and then my other friend, Jay Christopher King, who is the director of the Experiencer Group, which is a private community for
Mm.
people who have had anomalous experiences of all kinds, like even your dream would qualify as like an
Oh,
anomalous
wow.
experience. And so we all got together, and Jay also has a background in TV production. He worked on like a bunch of like kind of like reality and travel shows,
Mm.
went to film school, that sort of thing. And then Jordan has a business school background. And so we got together and we decided we wanted to make a docu-series that would do what we hadn't seen done before. So there's a ton of great docuseries out there about the phenomenon. There's a great place for people to start where, but a lot of what those are about is they're about like making the case that this is something we should even be talking about at all, which to be fair,
Mm.
a lot of people need that case made to them before they're willing to, go, which is totally rational, right? Like you should
Right.
you should have somebody convince you this is worth even talking about.
Right.
Um, but there was nothing that took it further. There was like really no docuseries out there that were like, okay, so starting with UFOs are real. What does that mean about the nature of our reality and who we are and, where science is headed and all of these different things. And so we wanted to create that. And so a lot of our experts, we have like a lot of PhDs involved. We go through the different theories of what this could be. We talk about the cover up and how it happened, that all of us were kind of led to believe that this thing wasn't real when it is. We talk about, and we also get really into anomalous experience itself, not just encounters with UFOs, but this kind of interrelated set of very bizarre experiences that people have and what it suggests about consciousness and human perception and kind of our place in the cosmos. And so we kind of like take it to the deep end, which is not for everybody, but for people who are into that kind of conversation, I think it's really fun.
Well, I was very excited. I watched the first episode of Cosmosis, and I really appreciate that it feels fresh. Like there's new stories in there, new things that I hadn't seen before. You kind of see the same case over and over and over again, and like, okay, I get it. But I love that you're expanding the conversation. So very, very cool. Well, this was fascinating. Kelly, where can people find you, your work, all that good stuff?
Oh, well, thank you so much. This was so fun. People can find me. My podcast is called Cosmosis, and our show is called Cosmosis. You can get links to everything, the podcast, the show, at cosmosis.media. You can also find me on X and all the various sites. I'm on almost all of them somewhere. So it's Kelly Chase. And if you just look Kelly Chase Cosmosis, you'll find me.
Well, there it is. A lot to mull over in this episode. Thanks again to Kelly for being on the podcast and to our patrons for voting on this topic. I hope you had fun and continue to be curious, ask yourself new questions, and, get back some childlike wonder so many of us are told to throw in the freaking garbage because nobody knows what the heck is happening. And that's kind of fun, right? Right, guys? At least that is what I'll be telling myself, to keep the terror at bay. I'm just kidding. I'm fine, I think. All right. Hope you have a great rest of the day. This was a good time, and I will talk to you soon. So glad you tuned into Self-Helpless. If you felt supported by this or a past episode, here's how you can support the show. Feel free to share it with someone who may enjoy the variety of conversations we have here. You can also become a monthly or annual patron of the podcast on Patreon at patreon.com/selfhelpless, where you can vote on topics, submit your own, or be a quiet supporter. 100% of Patreon and merch proceeds go directly to operating costs, keeping all episodes free, consistent, and available across platforms with minimal ads. If you want to show some extra lovin', you can leave an Apple Podcast review or send an email to share how Self-Helpless has impacted you. All of this and more goods can be found at selfhelplesspodcast.com. All right, love you big time, and thank you so much.